Marcus Chen had always been the kind of person who apologized for existing. At 28, he carried himself like a man perpetually braced for disappointment, shoulders hunched forward as if expecting the next blow life would inevitably deliver. His job at the data processing center paid barely enough to cover his studio apartment's rent, and his social circle consisted entirely of his co-worker Janet, who occasionally invited him to lunch out of what he suspected was pity. So when the Craigslist ad appeared offering a spacious Victorian home, move-in ready, $200 per month rent, Marcus assumed it was either a scam or a typo. But desperation had a way of making even the most cautious person take risks they'd never normally consider. His landlord had just raised his rent by 40%, and Marcus's savings account contained exactly $347.82. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. The address led him to Millfield, a town so small it didn't appear on most GPS systems. Marcus had to stop 3 times to ask for directions, each local giving him increasingly concerned looks when he mentioned Blackwood Manor. The third person, an elderly woman pumping gas at the town's single station, actually crossed herself before pointing him down a narrow dirt road that disappeared into a dense wall of pine trees. The house revealed itself gradually as Marcus's aging Honda Civic crunched along the gravel drive. First came the iron gates, hanging askew on rusted hinges. Then, the overgrown gardens where stone angels wrestled with ivy for dominance. Finally, the house itself emerged from the gloom like something conjured from a fever dream. Blackwood Manor was enormous, a sprawling Victorian monster with more turrets, gables, and architectural flourishes than seemed structurally possible. 3 stories rose into the gray October sky, topped by a mansard roof that bristled with chimneys and weather vanes. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood beneath weathered to the color of old bones. Windows stared down at him from every surface, their glass dark and reflective despite the overcast afternoon. Marcus sat in his car for several minutes, engine still running, while a reasonable voice in his head screamed that this was obviously too good to be true. Houses like this didn't rent for $200 a month. Houses like this probably cost more than his annual salary just to heat. But the reasonable voice was quickly drowned out by the desperate voice that reminded him he had 11 days before his current lease expired and nowhere else to go. The key was exactly where the ad had specified, under the third loose stone in the front steps. Marcus found himself oddly disappointed by this mundane detail. If he was walking into some elaborate scam, he'd at least expected more creativity in the key handoff. The front door was solid oak, easily 8 feet tall and carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in his peripheral vision. The lock turned smoothly, which struck Marcus as odd given the general state of decay surrounding everything else. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, and Marcus stepped into Blackwood Manor for the first time. The interior was a study in contradictions. The hardwood floors were polished to a mirror shine, while dust motes danced in shafts of light streaming through grimy windows. The furniture was an eclectic mix of periods and styles, as if someone had been collecting pieces for decades without any unifying vision. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, keeping perfect time despite its case being split down one side. Persian rugs covered the floors in rich reds and golds, their patterns so complex they seemed to move when Marcus wasn't looking directly at them. The rental agreement was waiting on an antique writing desk in what appeared to be a library. The room was lined floor to ceiling with books, thousands upon thousands of volumes in languages Marcus didn't recognize. The agreement itself was surprisingly standard legal boilerplate, printed on expensive paper and requiring only his signature. No security deposit, no credit check, no references required. Just his name and $200 per month, due on the 1st. Marcus signed with a ballpoint pen that felt warm in his hand despite the October chill that seemed to permeate the house. The first night was uneventful, which Marcus found almost disappointing. He'd mentally prepared himself for creaking floorboards, slamming doors, maybe even some dramatic temperature drops. Instead, he slept better than he had in months on a 4-poster bed that seemed to mold itself perfectly to his body. The house was quiet except for the gentle settling sounds that all old buildings made, and, when morning came, Marcus felt genuinely rested for the first time in years. It was on the 3rd day that he noticed the eyes. Marcus had been exploring the house systematically, partly out of curiosity and partly because his lease gave him access to the entire property. Most of the rooms were furnished but felt unused, as if they were waiting for occupants who never arrived. But it was in the portrait gallery on the second floor that Marcus first felt the sensation of being watched. The portraits lined both walls of a long hallway, depicting men and women in clothing spanning several centuries. Their faces were remarkably similar despite the obvious age differences in the paintings: sharp cheekbones, intelligent eyes, and an expression that suggested they knew secrets the viewer could never comprehend. What struck Marcus most was how their painted gazes seemed to track his movement as he walked down the hall. He told himself it was a common optical illusion. Everyone knew about paintings that seemed to follow you with their eyes. But when he stopped walking and stood perfectly still, he could swear he saw one of the figures, a stern woman in a high-collared Victorian dress, blink slowly before returning to her painted pose. Marcus shook his head and continued his exploration, but the feeling of being observed only intensified as days passed. It wasn't malevolent, exactly. More like being studied by something vast and patient, the way an entomologist might observe an interesting specimen. The sensation grew stronger during his fourth week in the house. Marcus would catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, but when he turned to look, he'd find only shadows and empty doorways. Doors he was certain he'd left open would be closed when he returned to a room. Books would appear on tables where he hadn't left them, always open to passages about transformation, sacrifice, and the price of power. It was during his sixth week that Marcus first heard the voice. He was in the kitchen making instant coffee when a sound like wind through leaves whispered behind him. When he turned, the room was empty, but the words echoed clearly in his mind: "You are not what we expected." Marcus dropped his mug, sending hot coffee and ceramic shards across the tile floor. He cleaned up the mess with shaking hands, telling himself he was experiencing stress hallucinations from work and the recent move. But even as he rationalized the experience, he knew something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with the house. The voice came again 3 days later, as Marcus sat reading in the library. This time, the words formed more clearly: "Your predecessors were stronger when they arrived. More confident. More substantial. Who are you?" Marcus asked the empty room, feeling foolish even as the words left his mouth. The response came not as sound but as images that flashed through his mind: the house as it had been decades ago, filled with people who carried themselves with an assurance Marcus had never possessed. Men in expensive suits and women in elegant dresses, all moving through the rooms with the easy confidence of those who had never doubted their place in the world. But something was wrong with the images. The people's eyes were hollow, and their smiles never reached those empty sockets. "What happened to them?" Marcus whispered. The images shifted, showing the same people but changed. Their confidence had curdled into something harder, crueler. They moved through the house like predators, their hollow eyes now gleaming with an appetite that seemed to consume everything they looked upon. And then, one by one, they simply faded away, leaving only shadows burned into the walls where they had stood. "They fed us," the voice said. "Their strength sustained us for decades. But strength without wisdom is merely another form of weakness, and eventually, they had nothing left to give." Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. "And what do you want from me?" "We are not certain. You are different. Weaker, perhaps, but also more flexible. Like a reed that bends in the wind rather than an oak that breaks." Over the following weeks, Marcus learned more about the entities that inhabited Blackwood Manor. They were ancient things, older than the house itself, drawn to places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. The house had been built on such a place, constructed by a family who understood what they were bargaining with and believed they could control it. The entities fed on human essence, not blood or flesh, but something more fundamental. Confidence, ambition, the fire that drove people to reach beyond their circumstances. Previous tenants had arrived full of these qualities, and the entities had gorged themselves until their hosts were empty husks, discarded like fruit squeezed dry. But Marcus was different. He had arrived already drained, already broken down by years of small defeats and casual humiliations. There was little for the entities to feed upon, which both frustrated and intrigued them. "You should leave," the voice told him one evening as he sat before the fireplace in the main sitting room. "You have given us almost nothing in the months you have been here. We grow hungry. Where would I go? Marcus asked, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. I can't afford anywhere else, and I have no one who would take me in. If you're going to consume me eventually anyway, what difference does it make? The silence stretched for so long that Marcus wondered if the conversation was over. Then, you do not fear us? Of course I fear you, Marcus replied. But, I've been afraid my entire life. Afraid of failure, afraid of rejection, afraid of taking up too much space or asking for too much. Fear has been the driving force of every decision I've ever made. What's one more thing to be afraid of? Fear should drive you away from us. Fear keeps me paralyzed, Marcus said, staring into the flames. Running away requires action, and action requires courage I've never had. It was then that something unexpected began to happen. The entities, in trying to understand their unusual tenant, began to share more of themselves with Marcus. He learned that they had once been human, individuals who had sought power and knowledge at the cost of their humanity. They had achieved a kind of immortality but had lost the ability to grow or change, trapped in a state of eternal hunger. We made ourselves strong by consuming others, the voice explained during one of their conversations. But, strength stolen is not strength earned. It has no foundation, no roots. Eventually, it consumes itself. Marcus found himself in the strange position of feeling sympathy for the entities that had been planning to devour him. They were trapped as surely as he was, caught in a cycle of predation that brought them no real satisfaction. They had destroyed their weak selves, as promised, but, in doing so had also destroyed their capacity for genuine strength. What if there was another way? Marcus asked one night. What do you mean? You feed on human essence, but what if instead of taking it by force, it was given freely? What if someone chose to share their strength rather than have it stolen? The idea was radical to beings who had spent centuries as parasites. They had always taken what they needed, never considering that their food source might be willing to cooperate. Marcus proposed an experiment. Instead of the entity slowly draining him, he would consciously share small portions of his essence, holding nothing back but also setting boundaries. In return, they would share their knowledge and perspective, helping him understand the nature of true strength. The process was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. When he opened himself to the entity's touch, he felt parts of himself being examined and tasted. But, instead of the violent extraction he had expected, it was more like allowing someone to drink from a well. The water was freely given, and the well was not diminished. In return, Marcus gained access to centuries of accumulated wisdom. He learned about the nature of power and how it corrupted when pursued for its own sake. He understood that true strength came not from dominating others but from mastering oneself. Most importantly, he realized that his perceived weaknesses, his humility, his empathy, his willingness to admit ignorance, were actually foundations upon which genuine strength could be built. The transformation was gradual but profound. Marcus began to carry himself differently, not with the aggressive confidence of those who had come before him, but with a quiet assurance that came from understanding his place in the world. He stopped apologizing for existing and started claiming space for himself without taking it from others. At work, Marcus began speaking up in meetings, offering insights that surprised his colleagues with their depth and clarity. He asked for the promotion he had been hoping for but never dared to request, and when his manager tried to brush him off, Marcus persisted with a calm determination that eventually wore down the resistance. But the most significant change was in Marcus's relationship with fear. He still felt afraid of failure, of rejection, of the unknown, but fear no longer controlled him. He learned to sit with the discomfort, to acknowledge it without being paralyzed by it. "You are becoming something we did not expect," the voice told him 6 months after their first conversation. "What am I becoming?" Marcus asked. "Strong. But not in the way we understood strength. You have not destroyed your weak self. You have transformed it." The entities were changing too. The symbiotic relationship Marcus had proposed was nourishing them in ways they had never experienced. Instead of the brief, intense high of stolen essence, they were experiencing steady, sustainable nourishment that actually allowed them to grow and change for the first time in centuries. As the year passed, Marcus and the entities developed something that could almost be called friendship. They shared stories, debated philosophy, and explored the vast library together. Marcus learned that the books contained knowledge gathered from across the world and, throughout history, wisdom that the entities had hoarded but never truly understood. Knowledge without application is merely trivia, Marcus observed during one of their discussions. You collected all this information but never used it to better yourselves. We thought we were already perfect, came the reply. We believed that immortality and power made us superior to mortal concerns. But immortality without growth is just an extended death, Marcus said. You stopped being human but never became anything better. It was this observation that led to the next phase of their relationship. The entities began to remember what they had been before their transformation, the people they had been before hunger and ambition had consumed their humanity. With Marcus's help, they started to reclaim pieces of their former selves, not to return to what they had been but to integrate those lost aspects with what they had become. The process was not without its challenges. There were times when the old patterns reasserted themselves, when the entity's hunger grew too strong and they attempted to take by force what Marcus had been freely sharing. But each time, Marcus stood his ground with that quiet strength he had developed, neither fighting nor fleeing but simply being present until the moment passed. You are teaching us something we thought we had forgotten, the voice said during one particularly difficult night. You are showing us that strength and gentleness are not opposites. As the second year of Marcus's residence at Blackwood Manor drew to a close, the house itself began to change. The oppressive atmosphere that had pervaded the building for so long started to lift. Colors seemed brighter, shadows less threatening. The portraits in the gallery no longer watched with predatory intensity but with something approaching benevolent interest. Other changes were more practical. The heating system began working more efficiently, pipes that had been frozen for decades thawed and flowed freely, and rooms that had been closed off for years opened themselves to welcome natural light. Marcus's own transformation continued as well. He had been promoted twice at work and was now managing a small team with a mixture of competence and compassion that earned him genuine respect from his colleagues. He had started dating Sarah, a librarian who appreciated his quiet intelligence and odd sense of humor. Most importantly, he had learned to see himself as valuable not despite his sensitivity and thoughtfulness, but because of them. The entities, too, were discovering new possibilities for their existence. Instead of merely feeding and surviving, they were beginning to engage with the world again. They started subtly helping the town of Millfield, using their accumulated knowledge to solve problems and ease suffering where they could. It was small-scale work, helping a farmer understand why his crops were failing, guiding a lost child home before dark, but it gave them a sense of purpose they had not felt in centuries. We have been dead things pretending to be alive, the voice reflected one evening as Marcus sat reading in the library. But you have shown us that existence without purpose is merely an elaborate form of suicide. Everyone needs purpose, Marcus replied. Even immortal entities that live in haunted houses. Especially immortal entities that live in haunted houses, came the amused response. As winter settled over Blackwood Manor, Marcus faced a decision that would have been unthinkable when he first arrived. Sarah had asked him to move in with her, to leave the house and start a normal life together. It was everything he had thought he wanted, a chance at ordinary happiness with someone who cared about him. But leaving would mean abandoning the entities who had become, in their own strange way, his family. More than that, it would mean walking away from the work they had begun together, the slow process of healing that was transforming not just the house but the entire area around it. You should go, the voice told him when he explained his dilemma. You have given us more than we could have hoped for. You deserve to live your own life. But what about our work here? What about helping the town? What about your continued growth? We will find a way to continue without you. We are no longer the desperate, hungry things we were when you arrived. You have taught us to be self-sufficient. Marcus considered this for several days, weighing his options with the same careful deliberation he now applied to all major decisions. In the end, he realized that the choice was not between staying or leaving, but between allowing fear to drive his decision or making it from a place of strength. He chose to stay, but not out of fear or obligation. He stayed because he had found his purpose at Blackwood Manor, because the work he was doing with the entities was meaningful in a way his previous life had never been. He stayed because he had finally learned the difference between settling for less and choosing what was truly valuable. Sarah was disappointed but not entirely surprised. She had sensed that Marcus was connected to something larger than himself, something that gave his life a depth and meaning that would be difficult to replicate elsewhere. They remained friends, and sometimes she visited the manor, marveling at how the imposing structure seemed to welcome her presence rather than threatening it. As his third year in the house began, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had started as a broken man seeking cheap rent and had found something far more valuable, a sense of his own worth and a purpose that extended beyond his individual needs. The entities had undergone an even more dramatic transformation. They were no longer parasites feeding on human misery but partners in a grand experiment in conscious evolution. They had learned to channel their considerable power toward creation rather than consumption, becoming gardeners of potential rather than harvesters of despair. Together, they had proved that strength was not about dominating others or even dominating oneself. True strength lay in the willingness to be vulnerable, to grow, to change, and to help others do the same. It was about destroying not the weak aspects of oneself, but the barriers that prevented those aspects from becoming sources of power. The house that had once been a trap for the ambitious and confident had become a sanctuary for transformation. Word began to spread, quietly and carefully, about a place where people could go to find their true strength. Not the brutal strength of the conqueror, but the enduring strength of those who had learned to transform their weaknesses into wisdom. Marcus never did pay more than $200 a month in rent, but what he received in return was worth far more than any monetary sum. He had found his place in the world, not by making himself smaller to fit into it, but by growing into someone large enough to change it for the better. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has learned that weakness transformed becomes the foundation of unshakable strength. And, sometimes, that transformation requires not the destruction of what we perceive as weakness, but its integration into a more complete and powerful whole. In the end, Marcus Chin discovered that $200 a month had indeed been a steal, not because he had found cheap housing, but because he had purchased something far more valuable, the chance to become who he was truly meant to be. And, in doing so, he had helped ancient entities remember their own potential for growth and change. The house still stands today, its windows no longer empty and cold but warm with the light of genuine welcome. Visitors sometimes report strange sensations within its walls, not the chill of supernatural threat, but the electric feeling of possibility, as if the very air vibrates with the potential for transformation. Marcus continues to live there, no longer the frightened man who first signed the rental agreement but someone who has learned that true strength comes not from never being afraid, but from choosing courage in spite of fear. He has become a guide for others who arrive broken and seeking, showing them that their perceived weaknesses may be the raw material from which genuine power can be forged. The entities, too, continue their evolution, learning each day what it means to use their considerable abilities in service of something greater than their own survival. They have discovered that immortality is only meaningful when it is spent in service of growth, change, and the nurturing of potential in others. Together, they stand as proof that even the most fundamental nature can be transformed, that strength can be built on the foundation of acknowledged vulnerability, and that sometimes the best bargains in life are the ones that seem too good to be true but turn out to offer gifts beyond imagination. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but, perhaps more importantly, the man who transforms his weak self into wisdom and compassion can help others discover their own unshakable strength. And, in a world that often mistakes brutality for power and domination for success, that kind of transformation is not just valuable, it is revolutionary. End of document.